Josh, I want you to know that I took your advice and I went on the media diet. I shut off my Reddit. I deleted the app. I've been off Facebook for a while.
Right.
I closed the media feed on Google, and I shut off the Apple News alerts. And I've narrowed my selection down to these apps if you want to take a look.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting. These are your hosts, Josh Levy
And John Walsh.
There are petabytes of data on any subject you want out there.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
So it looks like now your news feed, the apps you have on your phone are New York Times, Reuters, PBS NewsHour, NPR, ABC News, The Guardian, Wash Post, Politico, and then the Denver Post. So yeah.
Those last three, Washington Post, Politico, and Denver Post, I would say I look at the least, if at all. Whereas the other six, I seem to read the most, and I have fallen in love with Reuters.
Yeah.
It is great reporting. And if we went back to that media bias chart, it's in the top center.
Looks like at least half are not-for-profit news, and Guardian, probably more than the others, lean on international, or at least report international news.
Well, Reuters does too.
Reuters as well. You know, they report international more than a lot of the others. The others do great domestic work. And ABC News, they are the most trusted. I know that's not their nickname, not their slogan, but by polls, they should have that slogan.
Yeah. And they do great work. You know, I think we ended the last segment talking about what does bad media look like.
Yeah.
So I think we should just jump right into it and take a look.
We can. One thing I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind kind of going into a little more, is you mentioned you took the advice and it hasn't been long. When it's been maybe a month tops or 3 weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks or so.
Since we did that, since I brought up the whole concept of the stuff you agree with, that's
Get rid of the partisan stuff.
Yeah, that's the comfort food that you're just eating the ice cream on the couch, feels good, and it's easier, but it's making you slowly unhealthy and out of shape. And so if you want to talk about that whole, because in just 3 weeks, sounds like it's not too difficult.
No, it's not. And I think what happened was my stress level went down and my sense of outrage went down. However, my sense of concern did not.
Right.
So I'm still deeply concerned at what I'm reading in the news, but I'm not super outraged over partisan nonsense. So it's been refreshing.
Yeah, I'd like to see what you think when you're finally ready to unlock the feeds. And it's funny.
I don't know if I'll go back.
It's personally, I had to go and adjust a lot of my preferences for I like this channel, I like this topic, whatever, because it's the moment you go back, the more hypersensitive and acute you are to noticing the stuff that is opinion news that is even dangerously positioned as though it's only slightly opinionated. There's a lot of that stuff that is positioned as we're the safe opinion, or just positioned as though it isn't opinion at all. And you notice them so quickly.
Yeah, you pick them right off.
Yeah, you're not. You find out there's that term out there, clickbait, and you're so much less susceptible to clickbait.
One of the things you have to do when you're pulling up an article, a lot of news organizations will write in really small letters, analysis or opinion or op-ed. You need to start looking for those because if it's there, then chances are most of what you're reading is opinion. If it's not there and you can tell that this article is being driven by facts and reporting, you're going to get a better, more nutritious read of the news than the ice cream on the couch. So let's jump into it and take a look at bad media. Are you ready?
Bad media. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. if we want to go into the basement and understand who the worst was, we have to start with the Nazis.
Yeah.
So, Josh, this is going to be kind of a long-winded story, but it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
Did you ever see Dunkirk or The
Yep.
Darkest Hour?
Yep.
They're both about the same thing. They're both about this monumentally stupid decision that Hitler made. He had marched the Nazis into France, and he decided to stop at Paris. And he left 300,000+ British, French, and Belgian troops on the shores of France. And he could have diverted his whole army to essentially wipe out the British army all in one shot, but he failed to do that. He stopped in Paris, and many people think it was one of the biggest blunders in the Second World War. Well, it not only was it a blunder, it inadvertently saved Hitler's life. And the reason why is a number of months later or so, Churchill had the SAS within striking distance of Hitler's home, his compound in Austria. And they were sitting there just waiting for orders from the prime minister to take him out. They were going to do like a roadside bomb or an assassination or whatever. And Churchill thought back to Dunkirk, and he realized it's more important to keep Hitler in his place. Like we always talk about, like, if you could go back in time and kill Hitler. Well, Churchill had that decision, and he said, I'm going to keep Hitler in place because he's really bad at military strategy. Whereas his number two, the next in line to be Führer, was Hermann Goering, and Goering was a brilliant military strategist. He had fought in the First World War. He was a career military man, and he had a very high IQ. Yeah, he was addicted to amphetamines, but he was brilliant. And it was best to keep him at bay. So Churchill decided not to assassinate Hitler, and it kept Hitler in his position all the way to the end of the war. So when the Allied forces were closing in on Berlin, Goering escaped. He went through, as I understand it, a series of tunnels or alleyways to a car that was waiting for him, and it took him to his compound. Well, as I said before, he was addicted to amphetamines, so he wasn't thinking super clearly. So after Hitler was dead and Berlin fell, he decided, well, they're going to need another Führer, so I'll just turn myself in, and they'll make me Führer. So he got in his military outfit, and he had his driver drive west to find whoever. And the Americans picked him up. And they immediately incarcerated him for war crimes, and they sent him to Nuremberg. Yeah. And there were two people in Nuremberg that spoke German outside the prisoners. One was like an American serviceman, like a security guard, and the other was an Austrian psychologist that they had working there to make sure that the Nazis that were incarcerated had, good, strong mental health, weren't going to commit suicide, and couldn't use the, insanity plea in Nuremberg. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this introduction. The guy, the Austrian psychologist, his name is Gustav Gilbert. He wrote a book called The Nuremberg Diaries, and he had unfettered access to all the Nazis. And here's what he says at the beginning in the introduction. He says, I was allowed free access to the prisoners at all times, from the time of indictment up until the time of execution. This made possible a study of their reactions under a controlled condition for a whole year. And he goes on to say, this diary constitutes the raw data of this study and is presented for its historical as well as psychological value. I refrain from embroidering the data with too much psychological speculation, leaving that to later collaborative studies, which would be more comprehensive and objective than my own immediate reactions possibly could be. So kind of a public service he did there. So while he's in, and I'm just going to read this paragraph, while he's talking to Goering, what he would do is he would go and he would talk to these Nazis, memorize what they were saying, and then rush back to his office and type it down. And this is Goering shortly before his trial. And he says to him, or he says in the book, we got around to the subject of war again, and I said, contrary to his attitude, I did not think the common people are very thankful for leaders who bring them war and destruction. Why, of course, the people don't want war, Goering shrugged. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, a parliament, or communist dictatorship. There is one difference, I pointed out. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives. In the United States, only Congress can declare war. Oh, well, that's all very well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of their leaders. It is easy. All you have to do is convince them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. And it works the same in every country. I mean, that to me is like, that is an unraveling of the Nazis' propaganda technique. You convince people the Jews are the threat, and they're coming to take from you. And we are the ones brave enough to stand up to it.
Right. And to me, it's like also one of the key points of that stood out that I think a lot of people would have difficulty doing is understanding that, like, we are all vulnerable to falling victim to stuff like this. Yeah. Like when he talks about, you know, we like to think, yeah, but that's, you know, fascist Germany. That's not us. Especially that's not me and my group, right. You know, my political group X. You know, it's we like to have this belief in ourselves that we are impermeable to being hoodwinked, being misled, misguided, and being able to identify stuff like that. But
why do you think it's so effective?
Like, why would it work on anyone? I think it's because we do still have a, you know, from evolution, you know, the idea of like 4 walls and a roof is pretty new. Like, you know, humankind has been around for, you know, a couple 100,000 years, but, you know, it's only been the last like few hundred years where we've had a roof. So we still have this innate need to protect ourselves, protect our family. So if I'm like, you're under attack, there was a time for a very long time in human history where that, like, even the slight chance of attack was so dangerous to your well-being, and you had to act. You absolutely had to. So, and we still, it takes a lot longer than a couple hundred years to undo biological evolution, evolutionary biology, rather. So I think we still have this biological need to protect ourselves against threat, because
I see this.
Yeah.
I see this as a power tool.
Oh yeah.
You know, they use this on their own people. You know, the point the doctor is making is, how did you drag these people to war against their better interests? And he unravels that what we did was split them down the middle. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's a power tool that can be used elsewhere.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that political and rhetorical strategy, because it actually reminds me of this article I found, and I've been reading. This article is called Deplorables, Emotions, Political Sophistication, and Political Intolerance. And this was published in American Politics Research. It's a peer-reviewed article published in January of 2019, so a pretty recent article too. And this article kind of covers the main emotions used to manipulate an audience or target group, as well as kind of highlights the best counteraction to, you know, this, if you want to put out the flame, so to speak. So in this article, the researchers mentioned that the 3 main emotions that are kind of exploited to manipulate someone is fear, anger, and hatred. So I know those sound very, very similar. In some ways they are. But the difference is, for instance, fear is usually used first and early on, and it's very effective because the goal of fear is to get you to withdraw from another group. You know, if you think about it, like, here's a totally non-political example. I know it sounds silly. A good friend of mine and former roommate, he was absolutely like an absolute arachnophobe, to the point where he bought a bed frame that was like the tallest bed frame I think I've ever seen. He had like, you know, things where, I mean, he's actually in every other way like a pretty tough dude, but if there was a spider in the place, it was like he'd call me to come kill it for him. And but he there was no ration behind it. And you know, the more time I remember once there was one in the living room, and I convinced him for just 5 minutes. It was at the other end of the living room. I said, if it comes a lot closer, if it crosses halfway, I'll kill it, so just sit there. And the more you could tell, like after just 10 minutes of being in the same room, he wasn't as terrified. Just like we wrap around politically, like spend 10 minutes in the same room as a Muslim American. You'll learn like, oh, they don't have a bomb strapped to their chest. That completely goes against the desire of, like you mentioned, the Nazi Party, with creating fear, because creating fear gets you to separate yourself.
Close down.
Exactly, which leads to the anger, and the anger is what produces the confrontational mindset. So this is basically where that fear turns into aggressiveness and wanting to act on it. So, for instance, seeing a lot of people locked up, thrown in prison, prosecuted or persecuted. So I think, you know, when I read this, a good example that came to mind was early on with the Marxist Revolution in Soviet Russia. There was the Gulag group of farmers who they were just farmers, but since they produced a lot of the majority of produce that the country had, they were of like upper middle class status, and they convinced the people like, hey, look at these farmers, look at how well they live, they're the problem. And so eventually they stoked enough anger to where they went to these farms, beat the people, dragged them into prisons, completely took over, and that anger started like the Gulag work camps that were just absolute atrocities.
So it's kind of the call to action.
Yeah, exactly. It's the call to action based on you know, a vindictive nature and kind of conjured up retribution. The third one is hatred. So it is this unique hostility towards the group. So this mainly manifests in the difference between the hatred and the anger is usually the extent of the action and the more focused it is. So, for instance, Nazi Germany, they were originally upset and angry because they kind of blamed I know they weren't called the Allies at the time, but, you know, U.S. and forces that beat them in World War I. They were upset about like the money they had to pay in retribution to a lot of the victims and everything, and they blamed, and it was kind of generic. But the moment they started focusing more on Jews, it went from like, we're angry about our situation to we're turning it against someone and a specific group, and that's where I think, you know, the first two are bad, but I think based on this article, it's kind of saying like the moment you get to that hatred, ooh, it's not good. Like that's when the Gulag farmers were, you know, the women were raped, they were taken from their farms, they were blamed, like this specific group was blamed.
It justified the evil.
Exactly.
Yeah, it plays back into Goering's comment that, you know, you convince them they're under attack. That starts the fear. Well, what's the natural byproduct of that? Well, you start getting angry that these people are attacking you, and then you focus your hatred on them. I mean, what's interesting about this article, emotion-based theories of political intolerance is kind of the subtitle of this section. This is Star Wars theory.
Right.
Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hatred. It's the same, it's the same theme that clearly Lucas saw, out of the Nazis. He based the stormtroopers off the actual stormtroopers and so forth. What's interesting further down is moderating the effect of political sophistication. It's kind of the counterbalance to these three emotional things. I'm just going to read a piece of it here. He says, scholars further hypothesize that political sophistication moderates the relationship between emotions and intolerance. In particular, many argue that sophistication reduces the effects of emotions, such as that sophisticated individuals will be less likely to use emotions in their attitude formulation or formation and decision-making processes. In other words, the more educated or sophisticated you allow yourself to be, the less likely you're going to have your emotions manipulated by an outside source, which kind of leads to like me remembering like how, Nazis hated intellectualism, and they convinced all these people, grab your books and bring them down and burn them. It was to prevent the people from knowing and understanding why it was the Nazis who were the true threat and not the intellectuals. Fascinating stuff. It's when does that power tool get turned on?
Right.
Right. And don't get me wrong. What Goering lays out here is the mechanism. And the mechanism was used at very destructive, ends to it by the Nazis. And they divided their country that way. Now, if somebody else uses that power tool, that doesn't make them a Nazi. It just means they're using the same mechanism. And so where I hear this in American media is you cannot trust the liberals. Right. The liberals are out to attack us. They are taking our rights. They are taking our freedoms. Our values are under attack. We are the victims here. And if you keep the dial tuned right here, we'll give you the news and information you need.
Right.
And that is dangerous.
Yes.
And it should not be on the air. And I want to talk a little bit about bad news and how it has permeated the landscape of political dialogue in something that I call the Fox News algorithm. So let's take a look at that.
Yeah.
I don't think you can watch Fox News and not realize that there's a method to reporting their news. There's a rhythm to it. And sometimes it's very fast. And sometimes what you have to do is kind of pause. If you have live TV where you can pause it, you should when you're watching it, because they pack so much into one punch that you need to pause it for a second and just kind of dismantle it. So I noticed this during the Obama administration because Fox News would much rather be on the attack than on the defense. So this is the kind of the algorithm that they use, or the method they use. I'm going to talk about it, and then I'm going to kind of dissect it real fast. So here, imagine it's 2014 and Obama's president. You would hear them say something like, today, the New York Times reported that President Obama will be going to Indonesia for blah, blah, blah. But some people say he's actually going for yada, yada, yada. For more on this, we turn now to our trusted panel, of whatever. So if you pause it and you know a little bit about the news industry, this is what it sounds like in the most dripping, sarcastic way possible. Today, the New York Times, which we have told you numerous times is liberal, but what we failed to tell you is that we own the two major competing newspapers for the New York Times in that market. They reported something that was factually accurate and true, that Obama's going to Indonesia for blah, blah, blah. Who cares? But some people, and we won't tell you what people those are, but believe me, they're talking.
Right.
And they're saying he's going there for a very nefarious reason. For more on that conspiracy theory, we turn to this panel of people you don't know to chop it all up.
Right.
We won't go over to the New York Times and ask the reporter who reported it why they failed to report something. We'll just fail to report that, and we'll talk about the conspiracy theory. This is something that Fox News does over and over and over again. And if you're not paying attention, it'll just go right past you. And I'm sure you've probably, noticed them doing similar things.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like when you mentioned it, I mean, I think of a lot of my favorite news networks. They will say things like, we reached out to this person who is being accused of something or whatever, and, this is the statement we got, or we have yet to, receive a statement. And it's like, that's something a news organization would mention if they reached out to, so like, as you mentioned, if Fox was like, there were people on, even if they said there were people on social media saying this nefarious thing, or some people in the media like Rush Limbaugh.
They're not saying some people at the Pentagon or some people at the State Department. Like, it's not like they have a source that they have talked to. It's people are talking.
Right. And if they said something like, we reached out to the Obama administration and we asked for clarification, but we haven't received a statement yet, that is more along the lines of a news network. Like if you
It's due diligence.
Yeah, if you were accused of something, or people were saying if there was something negative, if you wrote an article that riled up a lot of people, ruffled some feathers, as a news organization, rather than talking to the people who are so riled up and offended or whatever, wouldn't you also reach out to you and be like, hey, John, this is what happened. Just if you wanted to clarify, or maybe you stand your ground like an Ann Coulter, like right. digs her heels in the sand a little deeper. But it's like you at least contact instead of, and I think that tends to be like a differentiator between the conspiracy theorists or not, is like a conspiracy. If there was a conspiracy about you, they create even more distance instead of being like, all right, let's reach out to John and bring him to the table and be like, all right, you're going to debate this person. Instead of trying to, get a deeper understanding, they try to like distort and create even more distance, just like how, think about something you see up close while you're driving by versus far away. Like you can't really make out what it is. Right. And it's easier for me to be like, yeah, John, that's a UFO out there.
To appeal to my ignorance.
Yeah, and then when you get closer, you're like, no, it's a Sonic that's lit up at night. It's not a UFO, but I can't convince you it's a UFO when we're sitting right next to Sonic.
Yeah,
but
and
from
I
far
feel
away.
What they do is they leave it to the viewer.
Right.
Today the New York Times reported, put it on pause, go to that article and read it yourself. Because if you did, you would start to see that, hey, it's not the New York Times. That's the other thing. They reported this, but they failed to report this other thing. That doesn't mean that they could have no sources that confirmed that other thing. That could be just so wildly out there. Just to say they're liberal, not because they reported something, but because they failed to report what some people are talking about, that's not a legitimate argument. So this idea of kind of pausing the content to digest it, I started that when I used to have a job that I had to commute like 80 miles round trip. So I had a lot of car time. And I became addicted to NPR as a result. But every once in a while, I'd switch it over to Rush Limbaugh. And he'd say something outlandish. I remember at the time, it was like the kneeling football player controversy. And I would pause it and digest what he said just to see how much BS he was putting out over the air. And so I saw the same tactics being used over and over again. And recently I watched Tucker Carlson do something similar. And I'll talk in a minute about why I think Tucker is in a worse position than Rush. But I want to read what Tucker did or said on his airwaves and just kind of pick it apart.
Yeah.
Okay? So this was May 2018. He says, "Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. For the past 18 months, Democrats in Congress and their PR consultants in the press have told you that Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election mostly because his campaign somehow colluded with the government of Vladimir Putin. To prove that, they have brought the usual business of government here in Washington basically to a standstill and launched the most divisive special counsel investigation in the history of the country. It's now gone on for more than a year, and yet, remarkably, to this very day, we still have no evidence of collusion." Okay, so there's a lot in that opening segment. I mean, this was within the first 25 seconds. And part of that 25 seconds was the intro, the intro music. So it's just like 20 seconds packed full of misinformation and lies. So let me back up and I'll read some of it. For the past 18 months, Democrats in Congress and their PR consultants in the press, if any news organization does not have the right to tell, who is acting as a PR company for a specific political party, it's Fox News, right? Regardless. So that's misleading at best. Have told you that Donald Trump has won the 2016 presidential election mostly because his campaign somehow colluded with the government of Vladimir Putin. I have heard no one say that. Right. I have heard no one come out and say he only won because he cheated. Right. I haven't heard Adam Schiff say that. I haven't heard Anderson Cooper say that. They've said it's troubling what they're seeing and the evidence is coming out and the Mueller report's disturbing, but none of them have actually said that. Right. But that's not the most incendiary. To prove that, they have brought the usual business here in Washington basically to a standstill. This was May 2018. The Democrats weren't in power. Right. They didn't bring anything to a standstill. Right. And then he goes on to say, and launched the most divisive special counsel investigation in the history of the country. The Democrats did not launch the special counsel investigation. Rod Rosenstein launched the special, a lifelong Republican who appointed Bob Mueller, a lifelong Republican, to investigate the firing of James Comey, a lifelong Republican. Right. If you want to read about it in the book Fear by Bob Woodward. Right. A lifelong Republican.
Right. And it's almost like it is like the tactic of leading the jury, that's, you see common what a news anchor like Tucker Carlson would do to his audience.
The reason why Tucker Carlson is in a much worse position than Rush Limbaugh is Rush Limbaugh is not broadcasting on something that calls itself news, and Tucker Carlson is. And if he is misinforming and lying to his viewing audience and doing so with the word news tattooed to the corner of the screen, that raises a great deal of concern as to what they are broadcasting. So in our next little segment, I want to kind of talk about the arguments that they use.
Thanks for listening to It Might Be Interesting.
Please join us next time. It's not a helpful argument. It's not going to bring those people around if all you're just playing into the narrative on Fox News that we're under attack by liberals. So if Bill Maher is out there saying these people are idiots and morons, the people listening to Fox News are going to go, well, yeah, they're attacking us. They tell their viewers liberals are out to get you. They think you're idiots and simpletons and morons. And then Bill Maher goes on the air and says they're idiots, simpletons, and morons. And it validates it just creates this media cycle, this spin. And neither side is helping.
Right.